Hello, everybody. Welcome to ACWS's Administrator Training on Reports and Queries, and we will dip into Excel too. So, yeah, I hope you are having a good morning, and I hope that you are ready to learn some useful, hopefully useful information about reports and queries on Outcome Tracker. So, I am going to show my screen here. There we go. Hopefully you can see my screen now. All right. So as I said, Outcome Tracker admin training skills for reports and queries. I forgot to update the title of this, so ignore that. So I just want to give you a few notes on the webinar forum. If you were in the training last week, it's much the same. We'll be a little bit more hands-on here. What we're hoping is that you might want to try these things along with us as we do them. So we'll give you like a little space to try what we're doing, and then if you have questions, you can ask them. And what we probably will do is, if you have questions, you can just type in the questions bar here. Say, hey, I have a question, and we'll unmute you, and then you can just ask a question. I think that will work. Still don't want to unmute everybody all at once, just because it can create a lot of feedback, even though we don't have very many people on this call. Today, it still can be a problem. But if you want to just type in here, hey, I have a question, we'll unmute you. You can ask your question, and we can discuss it. There are question periods kind of built into the webinar, so those like when we'll ask you if you have any questions, if you want to try to do the things that we've taught you. Let's see. Also, I just want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the ACWS YouTube channel shortly after this webinar. So the one from last week is ready to go up on the YouTube channel. I'll probably put that up tomorrow. And this one I'm hoping to have up maybe Wednesday of next week, but if not, then probably not until the week after that. But soon, shortly, relatively, this will be available on the YouTube channel. Also, many of you probably know this, but just in case you don't, the training here is based on the ACWS standard database and outcome tracker. Your shelter probably has made little changes here and there. So just a little heads up that your screens might look a little bit different than ours, but it should be close enough that you'll be able to understand what we're doing and where, and apply that to your database. And also for reporting, it doesn't make as much a difference for other training topics we've had recently. So just a little heads up. So these are the things that I'd like to get into today. So these are not in order. These are not in the order that we're going to go over them, but I just sort of wanted to go over what I plan to discuss. So outcome tracker, support resources and protocols. We'll discuss that towards the end. Probably everybody here already knows the support resources and protocols, but I just want to make it clear, just in case. Reporting to the provincial government, how that works. Again, probably everybody here already knows that, but just in case you don't. The steps of building a query. These are sort of under that filtering, summarizing, verifying the results. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll be comfortable with those things. Reports, modules, percentage sums, etc. The goals for this session. I want you to feel comfortable building basic queries and reports in Outcome Tracker. I want you to have the skills to troubleshoot Q's and R's, which is shorthand for queries and reports. It gets kind of tiring typing queries and reports over and over and over again. I want you to have the skills to troubleshoot queries and reports that are not returning expected results. I want you to understand the settings and features of queries and reports, and I want you to know important fields which are commonly pulled into queries and also filtered on. I want you to know how to build a multi-module report, which we'll discuss what that is. I want you to know how to have a report calculate percentages and sums. And I want you, of course, to be aware of the support resources and protocols. All right, let's talk about support resources and protocols. So you have the Outcome Tracker manuals, a little bit in this handout section. There's the admin manual, which was recently edited and revised. So you'll have that available to you. We are also working on a way to make the manuals, the admin and the basic user manual, available to members of ACWS in a convenient way so that we don't have to send out mass mailings every time we make a change to the manuals, or you don't have to try to find an old email with an attachment every time you need to look at it or something like that. So we're thinking of a way to provide that for members. It'll be something like Dropbox, like a link you can access whenever you need to look at the manuals, something like that. But that's what we're looking into. Hopefully we'll have resolution on that soon. Also, just so you know, there's the manuals, but there's also the training videos available anytime on the ACWS YouTube channel. Everything we discussed today will also be in the videos already, but also this very self-same webinar will be on the YouTube channel shortly too. So yeah, everything we discussed is already on there in some form, but also this video will be too. There's the VistaShare support tab in Outcome Tracker. So in that tab, you can access VistaShare's manuals, online help, and webinar videos. I will say that VistaShare's manuals are not as good as ACWS's manuals, in my humble opinion. And that is just because ACWS's manuals are written specifically for ACWS, whereas VistaShare's manuals are not. They're written for everybody who uses Outcome Tracker. So we have very specific information in our manual. So I would rely mostly on our manuals, but if there's a question in our manuals that you can't get an answer, if there's a question you have that you can't get answered from our manuals, it might be good to just check out the VistaShare manuals in case the answer's in there. So the support protocol, if you have a problem with Outcome Tracker that you can't get answered from the videos, the manuals, from the support tab, here is what you need to do. You should contact your shelter's OT administrator if that person is not you. I think largely we have the administrators on the call today. If that person is not you, and also I realize now that many of the people in this call today were also on the call last week, so that we've already reviewed this. I promise everything else after this is going to be new information, not stuff that we discussed last week. So I just want to make sure people are aware. After you contacted the administrator, if that is not you, and you still don't have a resolution to your issue, you contact OT support at acws.ca. That will put you in touch with either me or Kat, and we will try to help you troubleshoot your issue. And then if we cannot, ACWS support staff will contact VistaShare on your behalf. So one thing that's important to keep in mind is that you don't contact VistaShare directly. We have a licensing agreement with VistaShare, so we are meant to be a front line for you so that you don't have to rely on VistaShare support. So yeah, so just so you know, you are meant to message us at otsupport@acws.ca before you go to VistaShare. All right. So before we go on to the meat of the issues, are there any questions or comments? So if you just want to type in the question bar that you have a question, we can unmute you and you can ask your question. All right, I'm going to assume that that means that there are no questions. So, and if you have a question, just pop it in there and we can discuss it. So, building queries and reports. So, what I like to tell people is that queries and reports in Outcome Tracker is a forgiving process. And what I mean by that is that it is extremely difficult to create a query that will damage or modify your data in any way. Usually the worst that will happen when you create a query or report that is not accurate or not correctly built or not correctly configured is that it won't run to completion. And that's when you get that error message, please contact VistaShare support. Of course, don't contact VistaShare support. If you get that message, please contact us. But so I have spent some time trying to think of a way that you could build a query or report in such a way that it would modify your data or endanger your data, and I have not yet thought of that. So I don't want to say that it's impossible because, of course, once you say that, it's hubris. People find a way, but I'd say it's extremely difficult to build a query or report in such a way that your data is in any danger. So it's a very forgiving process. So I encourage you to get on and try your hand at creating queries and reports. So I like to think of queries and reports as kind of like building a house, where the query is the foundation and the report is the structure. So when you build a query and report, you have to build the query first, and then the report will sort of sit on top of that and be what you look at. So yeah, just something to keep in mind. That's sort of how I think of it, because when you need a report, you will always need a query underneath that report, which will usually mean creating a query. Sometimes the query is already created, but usually you'll have to create the query and then create the report. So just something to keep in mind. And let's go into Outcome Tracker and start creating a query. So to create a query, you log in as you normally would, and you go to Reports, which is right up here. And then we want to go to Add a New Query, which is in the upper right-hand corner here under Tasks. A new query. I'm going to create a basic danger assessment query. Oh, not danger assessment query. I'm just gonna, I think it's important to give your query a description that's clear. The description is the information that shows up like in this spot right here, where like here in this little gray text here. So sometimes you create queries and reports that are pretty similar with just a slight difference. Like you'll notice here, these are pretty similar. So it's important to, I think, have a description that clearly states what's in the query and or report, because it can become confusing. So I'm just gonna, a clear, concise description, DA total scores by date range. All right. So the location is where your query is going to be saved. It seems we have a question. So it's from Terry. Let me unmute Terry. Hi, Terry, are you there?
Yes.
So I see that I'm a couple minutes late to your question, but did my explanation answer your question already?
No.
No, okay. So let me
I'm
try to
just
see.
not sure what the difference is.
So I think that in the process of building a query and then building a report, which is what I'm going to do with you this morning, the answer will become clearer.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm hoping that by the end of the webinar, you'll have a clear understanding of the difference between a query and report. So maybe what I'll do is check in with you after we've been through all these steps and see if the distinction is clearer to you then. Does that sound good?
Okay.
Excellent. All right. Okay, so moving on. So by default, the query saves to your personal folder. And you can change where your query saves. I would recommend by default saving to your personal folder, especially if you are sort of new to query and report building and are quote unquote experimenting or trying your hand at it, because queries and reports in your personal folder are visible only to you and people with administrative access to Outcome Tracker by default. Your shelter may have changed those settings. They are changeable, but by default, they're visible only to you and people in your people with admin access. So what that means is that it will be less confusing for people to see your report in their folders. So if you put it in your agency's shared report folder, it can become confusing what the report is supposed to be pulling, especially if you're experimenting. You might accidentally create a report that doesn't run to completion, and if you have a lot of those in the shared folders, it can become confusing. So I would suggest by default saving to your personal folder. Of course, if you want to save to your agency's reports, you can. It's easy. You can just do that. You would just click whichever one you want to save to right there. But I'm going to save this to my personal folder. So I'll just save it to my personal folder. And yeah, so one thing to keep in mind is that I save reports and queries to my personal folder when I'm creating them, because I want to make sure that I get exactly what I want. So once you create your query and or report and you verify that it's exactly what you need, you can always move it to a shared folder, which is quite simple, and we'll go over that today too. So personal folder next. All right, this is where you build your columns. So the columns are what you want, the information that you want to show up in your query. So I do want to take this moment to discuss some of the important column groupings in Outcome Tracker. By default, your the columns will, these two columns, system name ID and full name, last, first, middle, will show up in your query. Usually you want those. You may not. You can always take them out by clicking this little X here by the side. But this pane right here to the right, selected columns, these are all the columns that are going to be in your query. Usually you want these in here. Only a handful of times in the 8 years I've been working with Outcome Tracker have I not wanted these in here. For example, if you want a query or report that you're going to send to external partners that you want to be anonymous, you probably wouldn't want those in there, because then it would be less anonymous, but typically you will want that in there. So I would just leave those in there. Some of the more important groupings, column groupings that you might want to be aware of. So these are all the groupings along the side here, and some of the more important ones that you want to be aware of are probably demographics. So if you accidentally take out the name and you want to put it back, that's where you would do it, right here. Or if you just want the last name, if you just want the system ID, there's address fields. If you want to pull in the person's city, you would do it in this little demographics area here. Excuse me. So another grouping under demographics that's also useful is roles. You may want to create a query or report that filters on roles, role membership status, or membership begin date, and maybe end date, probably less so for end date, but maybe. So what this means is roles are what we assign to the users of outcome trackers. So for instance, ACWS, residential adult, is a role. Your shelter probably has roles that are not ACWS standard that you also assign for other programs that you run in your agency. So if you want a report on a particular program that your agency runs, roles are often a quite simple way to filter for that and pull only people who are in that program, because only people in that program will have that role. Okay. Oh yes, Kat.
Hey, hi everybody. I am also on this call, and I just wanted to something I find really helpful when I'm personally, what I found helpful when I was learning how to design queries was to sort of understand where the data is entered for some of these column groups, just to sort of give you a sense of like what the grouping really means. And so for demographics, typically the columns that you find within that column group are pieces of data that get entered, but not necessarily on one of the forms that we've designed for data entry. So some of them can be added to those forms, but if you think about roles, I mean, those are, that's data that's entered kind of in the process of adding somebody to the site, but it's not connected directly to like the intake form or a case note form. And if you are to look in, some of you may have hidden the edit field, but if you were to look on the edit tab, oh, sorry, I mean the tab, not the field. On the edit tab, a lot of the system questions that are housed in demographics can be found on that edit tab, just to kind of give you a point of reference. So yeah, these are fields that sort of function a little bit differently than the fields you would see on forms. And in the sense that they sort of get managed differently than other fields. I'm trying to, I thought I was on track to explain this really clearly, but I think an example, like some of you may have experienced, so when you update the address or update the phone number on your forms, you'll notice that they update on all the historical versions of that form, and that's because that's a system field. Mm-hmm. So it's keeping current information about that person in sort of one place, managing it in one place, versus other questions that, you know, you can create a new form and update the types of abuse for somebody, and all of the historical information will kind of keep that point in time, those point in time answers for you if you were to go back historically on those forms. So anyway, I just wanted to explain.
That's a good point, Kat. Thank you for that. One thing I will also add to Kat's point is that if you are looking for demographic information, although it's a little bit misleading, you are most likely not going to want to pull it from the demographics section, but from the section for activities. So I'll get into that right now. So one of the other areas where you'll pull information, and this is probably the most often place you will pull columns from when you're building a query is enrollments. And you'll go enrollments, all enrollments, details, and then, because there's a few fields you want in here, and then show by activity, repeatable activities. So just to go over that once again, because if you're building a query, you'll likely do this quite often. You'll want to go to enrollments, all enrollments, details, and then there's a few fields you'll want to add from here, and I'll go over that in just a moment. And then questions, show by activity, repeatable activities. So that's an important sort of map to remember, sort of path to remember. So if you are looking for demographic information, most likely the fields that you want are going to be on the admission intake form. So if you click on that, then you'll get all the questions from the admission intake form, and these include questions like Aboriginal status, age, if estimated, cultural background, all of the provincially required fields, primary family member, family composition. So if you are looking for demographic information, most likely the thing that you want, the field that you want, is in the admission intake form activity rather than the demographic section of this. Because as Kat said, these are system questions, and most of our actual demographic information as ACWS comes from the admission intake form. I see we have a question here. Oh, sorry, never mind, false alarm. Anyway, let's see. So that is where you would get information on demographics most likely. Moving on here. So I said there are likely going to be fields that you want to add from all enrollment details. Let's add those now, because typically when you create a query, you're going to create a query to pull information from an activity. And you will likely need a few columns every time you create a query. Those columns are enrollment activity description, which you'll get by going to enrollments, all enrollments, and then details, this section here. These are the questions that are typically on every activity, although often they get taken off. But yeah, so enrollment activity description is one that we want. Enrollment begin date is one that we probably want too. Enrollment begin date is likely the question that if your activity has like date of completion of activity or something like that, like for instance, the DA has a date on it, the danger assessment has a date on it, we want the enrollment begin date from that question because that is what that field actually is. So enrollment begin date. And you might want to put enrollment hours. The DA isn't an activity like this, but if you have an activity where you might like have counseling sessions where or something like that where you add up the number of hours, enrollment hours is probably what you want. Enrollment provider, if there's like a question on the activity that's staff or something like that, that's where that comes from. So enrollment provider. But these last two are not typical. Typically, you would want enrollment activity description and enrollment begin date. At least those two when you're creating a query. And then we will go to our activities. So we are not doing admission intake form. We are doing danger assessment. And one thing I will say is that typically, it doesn't hurt to add more columns than you need to a query. The only thing that it can do is make the query unwieldy. It might take it a little bit longer to run, but also if you are hoping to just have a query, which we'll discuss earlier, then you might not want as many columns. But if you're going to build a report, typically it's totally fine to have columns in the query that you don't plan on displaying in the report. So if you don't know if something is what you want, it doesn't hurt to add more columns than you need typically. And you have to add a lot of columns before you get to a point where it starts affecting the speed of the query. So we want total score for questionnaire. So I'm just going to pull in 2 questions for this one just to keep it simple. Danger assessment type and total score for questionnaire. Let's say that that's all I'm really interested in knowing. And I'm going to keep enrollment hours and enrollment provider because even though they're not really applicable to what I'm looking for, the information I'm looking for, like I said, it doesn't really hurt to have them in there. So that is what we're going to do. And are there any other column groupings that are important to talk about before we move on? I think relationships are good to talk about. So if you want a query that will pull information on just the primary family member, this is where you would get that information. So it's unlikely that you'll ever need a query or report that will pull on or that will filter on relationships, but just to keep in mind, if you do, that is where you would find that information. So if you're interested in pulling information that was only primary member of the family, you would pull that information here. But most likely when you create a query or report, you'll be creating a query report and you're only interested in, you'll only be interested in entries in an activity and a date range. So I just want the number of danger assessment scores within a date range. Typically, when you pull a query, that's the kind of thing that you'll be looking for. And those instances, I just want to go over it one more time since it's really important. Enrollments, all enrollments, details, pull those activity description, enrollment begin date, and maybe a few of the other ones we discussed. Show by activity, repeatable activities, and then find your activity. All right, so we put it together. I'm going to click next. By default, it sorts by full name. So what that means is that when you create the query, the results will be displayed by the alphabetical person's name last first. So yeah, I think that makes enough sense. You can change it if you want. Like if you want to look at all the danger assessment types in alphabetical order, you can do that. Or if you want to look at the total scores in order of value, you can do that. But typically you won't change this. I almost never do. So let's click next. Filtering. Filtering is where you tell Outcome Tracker exactly what you're looking for. So if there is a problem with your query or report and it's pulling unexpected results, typically it's because the filtering is not working correctly or is not what you want to get achieve the results that you need. Excuse me. So typically, when you are creating a report, you're going to want to create at least 2 queries. One of those will be a query. Sorry, you want to create at least 2 filters. One of those will be a filter on enrollment activity description, and one of them will be a filter on enrollment begin date. And the second one is actually going to be 2 filters. So 3 filters you want to create on 2 fields. So typically when you create a query, the process will go like this. Enrollment activity description equals, and then you find your activity. So if I were pulling demographic information, for instance, from the intake form, I would choose admission intake form. If I wanted to know DVSA scores, I would do that. If I wanted to know goal attainment scores, I would do that. If I wanted to know occupancy information, I would pull that. But in this instance, danger assessment is what we're looking for. Click next. Now we want to add another filter, which is right here. So click on that, and then we want to do enrollment begin date. So typically, and I'm going to use the word typically a lot in the session because these are what you would normally do, but it might not be exactly what you need, but typically this is what you'll want. So enrollment begin date, you will filter on twice, almost always. And the first one you will filter on greater than or equal to, and the second one less than or equal to. And this is confusing, I think, sometimes for the novice query and report creator, because I think, and I made this mistake when I first started with Outcome Tracker, I think because there's enrollment end date in the columns too, where we pulled enrollment begin date, you can also pull enrollment end date. And I think logically what people think you should do is enrollment begin date for the first one and enrollment end date for the other one. But that's not typically what you would want to do. What you would want to do is 2 filters on enrollment begin date. And it's sort of like bookends, because what you're saying is you want Outcome Tracker to pull any enrollments in this activity that are greater than or less than this in their enrollment begin date, or less than or equal to this in their enrollment begin date. I hope that probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but I'll explain further once we create the query and I can show you more what I mean. So to create the filters on enrollment begin date are almost always a prompt too. So that is one of the nice things about Outcome Tracker, is that you can create prompts in your queries and reports so that you don't have to recreate the same queries and reports over and over again for specific date ranges. You can use the same queries and reports for different date ranges by making them prompts, which means that essentially you'll fill it out every time you run the report. So typically when you create these queries, you'll want an enrollment begin date greater than or equal to the first one, prompt, and create a new prompted field. And since this is the first one, we want begin date for the description. And let's click next. By default, the default value is today. I usually don't change it. Sometimes I've seen people change it to the first day of last month, because the query or report you run will almost always be querying the month that just ended. But I just change it. I just leave it to today. It doesn't really make a huge difference, because you can change it when you it's a prompt, so you'll change it anyway when you run the query and report. So click next. Now we want to add the bookend to that. So enrollment begin date again, this time less than or equal to another prompt, create new prompted field, and this time we want end date. And let's just say that's all that I'm interested in. I just want danger assessments from between these 2 dates. Let's click finish. I'm just going to change this to the parent agency only. This is not a setting that you'll have to worry about. I'm just doing it for me here, because otherwise it will make the query too slow. I'm just asking it to pull information from ACWS only. So let's look at results. So let's say I'll put in a year-ish. So here we go. These are the scores for the danger assessment. So basically what I've said is, if the enrollment begin date is greater than this, but less than this, which is to say between these 2 dates, to pull the danger assessment and show me the total score. You can see, obviously, some of these are blank. That's fine. Yeah, so that's sort of, I hope that makes it clear what I was saying about the bookends for the begin and end date. So we've created our query. Let's say that we want only 1 row per person. That would be to summarize. So summarizing is an interesting thing that you can do for your results on Outcome Tracker. So if you want only one row per person, you would likely want to summarize on these two fields. So what you're basically saying is you want to group by the name, which is to say you only want one line per name. And these are what you do with the rest of the other things. So by default, if your, let's say by default, if your number field, if it's a text field or date field, it will say a unique list by default. But if it's a number field, like the total score is a number field, the enrollment hours is a number field, by default it will sum. Typically you would want some, but in this case we wouldn't want some because this will just make their DA scores really, really high. So let's just say we want the last entered value. And let's do the same thing for here too, last entered value. So there's a lot of settings on here. The most important, I would say, is sum, average, count of unique values, unique list, first entered and last entered value. So sum and average are pretty self-explanatory, I think. Unique list is just like it'll be a list of all the values that that person has entered into that field. And count of unique values is sort of the same thing, but instead of listing it, it just gives you a number. So if there's 3 DA scores, it'll just return a number of 3. First entered value is the value that was first entered in that field. Last entered value is the value that was last entered in that field. I want last entered value, which is to say I want the most recent DA score. Let's look at results. There we go. 1 line per person, 3 results. This is a unique list. You'll see all of the GA enrollments and the last entered score. All right. Let's say you build your query, you build your report, and you realize that there is a column that you have forgot to add to the query. Happens all the time. Happens to me all the time. If you want to add another column, you go to columns. This is a list of all the columns in your query. You go to add, and you'll get this familiar interface. This is the same exact interface. Let's say I want to summarize by enrollment ID, which is something I'm going to discuss right now. Let's go to finish. So now I can summarize by enrollment ID, and I probably wouldn't want to do this. So what enrollment ID is every time you enter somebody into an activity, you enroll them in an activity, to use the parlance of outcome tracker, you create a system ID called enrollment ID. And summarizing on enrollment ID is useful sometimes because it can increase the longevity of your query and report. And things can become confusing sometimes especially if you're filtering on roles or relationships, it can become confusing. So summarizing on enrollment ID can be useful. So just something to keep in mind, summarizing on enrollment ID. Typically, it won't make a difference in your results. So we see we have 11 results, as we did before. I summarized by the name and system ID, but typically it won't make a difference on your results, but sometimes it can. And I would say when it does, it probably reflects more accurate information than when it doesn't. And when it doesn't make a difference, then it doesn't make a difference. So it's kind of a safeguard against duplicating information. So something just to keep in mind. Yeah, so I think that's the basics of building a query. Let me see if there's anything in here that I didn't. Okay, yeah, so let's, so we talked about the most common filters, which would be enrollment activity description and enrollment begin date, enrollment end date. to the two filters on enrollment begin date for greater than and less than or equal to. One thing I do want to touch on is the difference between enrollment begin date and admission date. So if you are pulling information from the admission intake form, which if you are pulling information from activity, it will likely be from the admission intake form, just because so much information is stored in there anyway. And most of the information that you answer is on the admission intake form. If you are, I'm just going to go to the column section to show you. If you are pulling information from the admission intake form, you will likely want to, the filters that I put on enrollment begin date, you will actually put on the admission intake, which is right here, admission date. So the admission intake form is kind of a special case. It's the one used most often in outcome tracker, so just something to keep in mind. The enrollment begin date is different for the filtering on date is different for the admission intake form. You'll likely want to create those filters just as I showed you for the enrollment begin date, but not on the enrollment begin date field, on the admission date field. So I'll go ahead and go through that with you. The admission date is not actually a field on the danger assessment. The danger assessment uses enrollment begin date, but just so you know what I mean. So let's just say that this is something from the admission intake form. For argument's sake, we would want to do admission intake greater than equal to prompt, create new prompted field, begin date, just as we did with the enrollment begin date. I'm just going to cancel this. Just so you know exactly what I was referring to. And that's another thing too, just as you can add columns at any time in the report and the query making process. I'm just going to go ahead and delete the admission date because it's not really applicable. Just as you can add and delete columns at any time in the query making process, you can also add and delete filters and change the summary. So this is part of the reason why I say that creating queries and reports and outcome trackers is a forgiving process, because these are settings that are very easily changed. So let's summarize or verify the results. Let's say I run this query, it's for a year, there's 11 DAs. Let's say I know for some reason, often when you are in your database, you'll have a rough estimation of what the numbers should look like. Let's say I run this query, I'm expecting 20 results, but I only get 11. Like, what's going on? How can I figure out what is happening? Why perhaps some things are not getting pulled into the query that should be? This is probably one of the most difficult things to talk about on this webinar, because unlike with creating queries and reports, there's not a typical thing that it will be. It could be any number of things, but I'll give you some basic skills for troubleshooting, for trying to understand why you might be returning results that you're not expecting. So if I click on one of these, I will be taken to this person's file, and I'm going to go to the danger assessment. And I'll be able to see that this person has, it looks like they have 1, 2, 3, 4, however many danger assessments within this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Let's say this person has 7 danger assessments here, but only 5 are showing up in the query. I can go back to the query. Let's do that. This isn't what's happening. It looks like all their queries, all their danger assessments are showing up. Open this up. Go back to their danger assessments. And I can find out which ones aren't showing up by the enrollment begin date. Look at those and see why those might not be showing up. It may be something like oh, let's say these right here I wanted to count in as danger assessment, but they don't have dates. They wouldn't show up if they don't have dates because we have a filter on dates. If I had a filter on like total score, one thing I could do is have a filter on total score is not empty. So basically what I'm saying is I don't want any values where the total score is empty. And if I go back, I'll see that that greatly reduces the number of, well, not greatly, it takes away 3, but so suddenly this person doesn't have sums, so like I might click on the click on this file and realize that some of these actually don't have total scores. Anyway, I don't want to spend a lot of time, but that's basically like you can go, it's hypothetical, but you can go through the queries and reports and try to figure out why a person's results are not showing up in the query. Most likely there's something in the enrollment that is being filtered out somehow. So that, but it is good to verify the results just to make sure that it's what you expect, what you anticipate, and that it's correct. Let's see. So common errors that you might see are errors in the summarization. So for instance, if I wanted to summarize by this and take this away, you can summarize by both of these at the same time because they should be the same for each person. So, and then, yeah, so I won't go into too much detail because it depends on the specific case, but often I find that when there are errors in the results that it's not returning what it should be returning, then it's sometimes a problem with the way it is summarized, and without a specific point, it's hard to troubleshoot. So. Another common error when there does seem to be an issue with the results is a filter on roles. What I find is that when people filter on roles, they often inadvertently leave out results that they don't mean to, because they will leave out results from people who don't have that role. And often that is what you actually want to do, but they often don't realize that that is what's happening. So just something to keep in mind, that if you are filtering on a role, you may be leaving out results from that you don't intend to. Summarization, date filters, we've pretty much gone over. All right, so I'm just going to ask if there are any questions from the audience right now. I don't see any questions coming in. Kat, are you there?
Hi, yes, I am.
Do you think there's anything you'd like to add to what I was describing just now?
No, I don't think so. I think perhaps we want to give folks a chance to play around a little bit. What do you think? Yeah. Okay.
That sounds good. Mostly I wanted to mute my mic so I could take a drink of water. Yeah, so why don't the attendees play around with information that I just gave them, and then if they have a question they can ask. All right, so the attendees have had a few moments to try out what I have, the information that I have shared. I don't see any questions, so I think let's move along. So often when you are creating a query for activity information, as I am for danger assessment, you will come across a point where you will actually need to pull information from more than one activity. This is a little bit trickier. So when you create a query, you cannot pull information from two activities into the same query. For instance, let's say I wanted to know how many people had a danger assessment score of below, I don't know, let's say 15. A danger assessment score of below 15, and also I wanted to know what their immigration status was. Not immigration status, but cultural background, let's say. Or whether or not they were born in Canada. So let's say that that's something I want to do. The danger assessment total score is in the danger assessment activity, and the whether a person was born in Canada is in the admission intake form. I cannot pull that into the same query because of the way that Outcome Tracker works. That query will not run to completion. What I have to do instead is create a subquery to pull that information in. I find that people create subqueries. The most typical need for a subquery is when you need demographic information beside activity information. So like I just described, I need to know the number of total scores in Outcome Tracker for danger assessment below 15 for people who were not born in Canada. So I need to create a subquery that pulls in the information from the admission intake form. So I'm just going to go to ports. I'm going to create a new query just as I did before. I'm going to create the subquery, which is just like creating a regular query. It only becomes a subquery when you join the two. So I'm just gonna do that. I'm gonna save it to my personal folder. And then we come back to this familiar interface, and I want to go to details, enrollment activity description. And because this is subquery, reporting or filtering on enrollment begin date isn't as important. And also because it's the admission intake, we wouldn't use enrollment begin date anyway. We would use admission date, which is in the questions. I'll add it to the columns because it doesn't hurt to have it, but as I said, you don't really need it for this one. And I'll explain why in a moment. But we do want to find the if client is not Aboriginal, was client born in Canada? I want that. Click next. Click next. Let's add the enrollment activity description. That would be admission intake form. Next. And let's just go ahead and finish that. We don't need to add any more else. Let's go to reports. Oh, wait a minute. I'm going to go back here. Make sure I change that to parent agency only. Again, that's not a setting you have to worry about on your database. Just for the purposes of this call, I want to make sure I get that. And I want to go to my personal folder. So I want to find that original query, which is this one right here. So we're back to my first query. And now I'm going to join those two queries. The one that I just made that pulls whether a client was born in Canada and this one. And I do that by going to add. And then I go to advanced queries. So you'll see that here are all the folders that queries are in. Mine is in my personal folder. These are all the queries in my personal folder. And what did I call that query? I wish I had made a note. Client born in Canada, here we go. And let's just, the only thing typically you would want to add are the fields that you are, so these are all the fields in the query, just like before. The only ones that you would want to add typically are the ones that you're interested in. So I'll just add that one and click finish. This is how they link up. By default, it goes system name ID equals system name ID. What you're basically saying is that this field equals that field in both queries. By default, this is the setting. I don't know why you would need to change it. You might, but typically you would just leave it the same. Leave it at its default. And now let's go to results. And now we see we have this extra information. So let's go to summarize. And let's say we want the last entered value, what they last said to that question. And now we have this, whether a client was born in Canada. I just want to explain, typically when you, like a question like, was the client born in Canada, that won't change. A client will always not have been born in Canada or been born in Canada. The data in the ACWS database is fake data, as you can probably tell. Redbird, Betty Boop, these are fake names. It's not actual information. So we sort of enter it in at random sometimes, and so we get results that you will not see typically in your database sometimes. Typically, if you have this question in a query and there's more than one result, like there's more than one answer to it, typically it will be the same. If not, then maybe somebody was confused about something when they were answering the question or something like that. But typically a question like that will not change from intake to intake. Even if they fill it out more than once, it should have the same question or the same answer. So just a little note to keep in mind. So that's how you create a subquery. And as I said, typically when you create a subquery, you're probably going to want the link to the admission intake form, because there's probably some demographic information that you're interested in knowing, as opposed to other ones. Like for this, for instance, the danger assessment type, I can compare whether or not a client was born in Canada against the danger assessment type. Because if a client wasn't born in Canada, typically we would want them filling out a DAI. But here I can see that there are some people who were not born in Canada that are not filling out the DAI, and some people who have filled out the DAI that may have been born in Canada. So that could be useful information to know for your database. It's just something to keep in mind. All right. Let's say I want to know only the people who weren't born in Canada, so I can add a filter. And now that I've added that column, I will see that that column is there. Was the client born in Canada? Equals no. Now I will only pull those people who weren't born in Canada. So something you can do. So yeah, that's subqueries. So basically you just create a second query and join it to the first one by going to advanced. One note I wanted to hit on is whether you should use a subquery or a multi-module report. So A multi-module report, we'll get into that more later, but when you run a query or report, when you run a report, you can create a report so that it basically essentially runs multiple reports at the same time, which will return information. So for instance, if I wanted to know the number of danger assessments, total scores, and also I wanted to know the number of people who we served who weren't born in Canada, that would be a multi-module report. If I know that I always want that information pretty much at the same time, I can make a multi-module report and pull that. But if I want to know the total scores in relation to whether or not they were born in Canada, then that will be a subquery. So we'll go over multi-module reports a little bit more. Maybe I'll discuss a little bit more the differences when we go into the multi-module reports. So are there any questions or comments at this moment? I don't see any. All right. Let's move along and get into reports. One thing I want to say about reports is typically you will create a query and then create a report. Oh, we have a question. Oh, sorry, false alarm. We do not have a question. Okay, so one thing that I want to get into about queries and reports is that a query may be all that you need when you run when you are looking for results from your database. So typically you will create a query and then create a report that pulls that information from the query into interesting and relevant ways, displays the information in interesting ways. But it may just be the case that you just want to know the number of danger assessments within a time range. In that case, the query is all I would need because I can run the query and I see that I have 11 results. Or I want to know the number of people. I would summarize by first name, I would summarize by name and system ID, and click update here. And get the results. And I know that in that date range, 3 people have completed at least 1 danger assessment. So that's all I need. If that's all I need, then the query is just fine. I think sometimes because we talk about queries and reports in the same ways every time, we kind of get into the mindset that we always build a query and then we always build a report on top of that query, but we don't need to. Sometimes a query is all that we need. Sometimes we just need the number of things within a date range. In those instances, then the query is just fine. But often we will need to know, for instance, the percentage of people who had a DA score of less than whatever, or perhaps maybe we want to know the percentage of people who completed a D as regular. I don't want to use the word regular, but like a original danger assessment compared to those who did a DAI, if meant for immigrant women, or DAR meant for people in same-sex relationships, or Walking the Path Together DA meant for Aboriginal clients. So that is something that if we want to know like the percentage, if we want to know the percentage of people who did a particular thing, or we want to know, for instance, or maybe we just want to know the number of people who did a DAI. Well, we can count them here because there's not very many results, but if there were hundreds of results, then that would be quite a pain. We would want to do a report. So let's go to reports. So we went over how to create a query, typical filtering on a query, and how to create a subquery for that query when we want to display, like typically we would want to display information from the admission intake form, that's demographic information. So we went over all of that. So let's say now we're ready to create our report. We want to know the number of danger assessment types in each number of danger assessment types that have been completed within the time span. So let's go over how to do that. So you would go to the Reports tab, as I have here. And then in the upper right-hand corner here, under Add New Query, which we're familiar with by now, we want Add New Report. Let's create our report. Let's say we want to call it Danger Assessment Types. And let's say in the description, we want to do by whether a client was born in Canada. All right, cross-tab report is almost always what you want. You can do a report with a chart, a letter merge. I've never used Outcome Tracker for a letter merge, but it's possible to do. I think it's less applicable to us because we often don't put people's home addresses in the system, but you can do a letter merge with here. So almost always it's a cross-type report that you want. It's saving to my personal folder. I'm going to keep it there. Just like the queries, you can change the folder if you need to. Let's go to next. We can name the module something. Let's do that. Let's call it DAs and client portal account. Let's do that. You don't have to name it something. You don't have to name it anything at all. That's fine if you don't. If you're only having a one module report, especially, you don't need to name it. But I always think more information is better than less information, so I typically name my modules. And also, if you are creating a multi-module report, then naming your module becomes pretty important. And I'll discuss what a multi-module report is after we finish this. So just something to keep in mind in the future. All right, so now we want to select our query, and just as we selected the query for the subquery, we want to do the same exact thing. So let's do, I think it was this one here, so DA query. So let's do that. Click next. Yes, it was this one. So the horizontal and vertical headers. This is where you pick what information will display in the report. So the horizontal headers, as you can see with this little, it's not terribly clear, this little picture here, but they're the ones in red. So it's these ones right here. So anything that you choose in this area will display along here. Typically, what I like to do in a report like this is choose enrollment activity description, because enrollment activity description is going to be the same for everybody in this because we've filtered on enrollment activity description. I will typically put that on top. In this instance, let's say I want to see the number of the answer to this question broken down by this question, which is what we're trying to do. So let's say I want to put this one on the top. And then you'll see that this changes when we want the vertical headers now. Which one did I put? I already forgot which one I put at the top. Oh, danger assessment type is at the top. Okay, so let's put this one along the side. And then let's finish. By default, when you create a report, it takes you to the Edit tab by default when you first create it. If I could change one setting in Outcome Tracker, that is probably the #1 setting I would change. I wish it took you by default to the View tab, because I think it's really important to see your results immediately. So this is our result. These are our results here. So we can see that the number of people who answered no to this, to whether they were born in Canada and the types of danger assessments that they've been doing, and so on and so forth. So that is a breakdown of the danger assessment type by whether or not the client was born in Canada. Let's say I want to know the percentage of people who were born in Canada that did a DA. So in those instances, I would go to edit. So by default, outcome tracker, it will display information in report and count form only. So basically, it's just taking the number of results and counting them. And also, and in reports all the time, you want other things, like you want maybe the average, or you want the percentage, or you want a sum. You can do all those things in outcome tracker. It just doesn't do them by default. So what you have to do is, if you want a average, or what did we say we wanted? We want a percentage for this. So we would go to edit cell, and here we see we have count, but we want percent of column count. So basically we want percentages based on the numbers in the columns. So let's do that. Let's change this to percentage. So this is the label, so this is what will display on the report. Let's change this to number, sign, update, close. And let's take a look. So here we see out of the DAs, one person said no, they were not born in Canada. One person is unknown. Out of the walking the path togethers, one person, the only person who did walking path, said that they were not born in Canada. DAI, unknown. DAR, more split here. So it's just sort of like, and then we have the total here. So out of the total people who did danger assessments, 27% said that they weren't born in Canada. So it's just sort of like an example of how you would use a percentage. Normally you would want columns. Sometimes you might want rows. I can explain the difference, what I mean by that. So here we added the percent of column count. We might want percent of row count. And I'll just leave those both in there for now so we can know the difference. And I think the difference will be clear once we look at the results with both of them in there. So we see this percent of row is, so there's 3 total in this row, so 33% who said no to this did a DA, 33% who said no to this did a walking path together, whereas half, that is one out of the 2 people who did a DA, said no. So it's just sort of a different kind of, oh, I have a question. Oh, never mind, false alarm. This is sort of a different way of doing the percentages. Typically, in my experience, when you do percentages, you will want to do percent of column count because you'll be more interested in seeing the breakdown based on the columns rather than the rows. But it may be that you want the rows. So that is how you do percentages. I'm just going to delete these just so it's not too confusing, the report. Now that you know how to do that, percentages, count, sum, average, minimum and maximum is something I use sometimes. So basically what I'm saying is I want the highest or lowest number in there that to display. We did percentage, row, and column. Another one that gets used quite often is sum. So, but in order to do that, actually, I'm going to add the total score. So let's say I create the report and I realize that there's something I need to add, as I just did. I want to go to Edit Module. And then we see we have the horizontal headers. This is danger assessment type, and the vertical headers. Let's say I want to add another vertical header. Typically, when you add things to a report, you'll want to add it as a vertical header rather than a horizontal header. Not always the case, but typically. I want to add the total score. I've added that, so then I want to close. So now we see we'll have the Aboriginal, or sorry, if not Aboriginal, was client born in Canada, and then the total scores. Let's take a look at that. All right, let's just say that so what's saying, these are the number of people with 0 as a score, these are the number of people with 5 as a score, so on and so forth. Let's say that I want, this is a number field. Let's say I want to sum it. So instead of count, oh, you have to have something in here. So I'll do add sum first. Delete count. And you'll see here where it says sum field enrollment hours. That's not right. You want to look for the field that is right. So you have to make sure that you're not summing on the wrong field. So total score for questionnaire. And these are all the number fields that are in the query that underlines the report. So let's update that. Typically, when you sum, you also want to go into here and delete the data labels. You don't want data labels. Let's do totals. So what that means, what I just did is so right here, these are the data labels. Those are all the responses that are available in this area, in this question, and then the number of people who answered them. When you sum, typically you don't care about the data labels because those are just the numbers, like you saw before, it was like 0, 5, 7, so on and so forth. Typically, that's not useful information when you're summing. So I just decided to not display that. So let's go to View. And let's look. We can see the total score for people who answered DA is 40, 0 for walking the path, DAI, DAR is 18. So what that means is that this sums everybody who did a DA, and that was their total score for everybody who did. So out of these two people, they got 40. So I don't know if that's 20 plus 20 is 40. I don't know if it was 30 and 10, so on and so forth. So I'm realizing now that maybe a total score isn't useful. I actually want an average. So let's do that. This is something that typically might happen. So let's go into here. We don't want the sum. We want the average. I have to find that field again. Update. And let's take this off. It's not useful. Close. And here we see the average score is 20. The average score for DAR is 4. The average total score is 7. So something to keep in mind there, that you can do sums, you can do averages, you can do percentages, column, row. There are a number of ways the useful ways that you can display the information in reports that will help you when you're doing your data analysis. All right, so we talked about horizontal, vertical headers, percentages, sums. So maybe before I move on, I'll get back to the point that was raised earlier about the differences between a query and a report. So as you see, when we created the report, we had to find the query that had the information that we wanted to display in the report. And that is the difference. The query pulls the information that will then display in the report. And as I said earlier, sometimes all we need is just that number, the number of people who completed a DA, for example, or the number of people who completed the number of people within a date range who were not born in Canada, for example. Sometimes we just need that number. In those cases, we can just use a query, just get that number and move on. But sometimes we want more in-depth, a little bit more in-depth analysis. For instance, maybe we want to know the percentage of people who completed one form of DA as compared to another. In that case, we would want to report. So query pools all the raw data in your database and reports display that information in interesting and relevant ways. That's sort of how it works. That's why I like to think of a query as sort of the foundation and the report as the structure. That's how I sort of think about it, if that's a helpful analogy. So I hope that makes the difference between a report and a query clearer to those who were having trouble. And that, let me check in. That was Terry. So I'll unmute Terry now. And so Terry, are you there?
Yes.
Does that explain the difference between a query and a report more clearly to you?
It does.
Okay, excellent. I'm glad that we were able to help there. All right. Moving on, multi-module reports. So let's say often happens with reporting requirements that I have 2 bits of data that I know I will always want to pull at the same time. For instance, maybe I want to know the danger assessment, how many people have completed a danger assessment as compared to whether or not they were born in Canada. And I also want to know, let's say, the number of danger assessments by the total score by danger assessment type, let's say. Let's do that, because then we can just use the same query. I don't have to create a new query. Although if it's from the same query, you can just put it in the same report. You don't have to create a new query, a new module, but just in this instance, let's pretend that this is a different query that we have that has information that we want to display in this report as well. So we can do a multi-module report, and you'll see that multi-module reports are typical for the annual stats reports in Outcome Tracker and the provincial government reporting that you have to do in Outcome Tracker. This is how we get so much data to display in one report at the same time. Those are instances of which we know all this information will need to be displayed at the same times every month or every year. So those are multi-module reports. So what we want to do when we create a new when we decide that we want to create a new module within this report and we want to go to new cross tab, add new cross tab. And when we're presented with the same interface that we were presented when we originally created the report, module title, let's say we want DA total scores by DA type. And we want to select that same query, but typically you would select a different query, but just for this example, let's put danger assessment type along the side, on top here, and let's put total score along the side. And then we want to decide if we want it next to the original query or the original report or below. I'm going to put next. And click finish. And we see we suddenly have another thing here. So we go to view. We see we have this one and this one. So, and then we can sum this or average this as we did over here for the total score, which would essentially make this the same thing as this, but that's just an example of how you can add a multi-module, another module to a report, and so that they run at the same time. So typically, if you have reporting requirements where you know you're going to be running the same information at the same time over and over again, you can create a multi-module report instead of having to run this report and then run that report. You can just create a report that has them both embedded at the same time. So you just run one run report. So the benefits, as I said, is you will have the one report that you have to run when reporting time comes around, or whenever you need to report on the fields that you're talking about, or whatever fields are applicable. You'll have just one report that you need to run. The drawbacks are, one of the drawbacks is if you add a lot of fields or a lot of modules to a report, it makes it very slow, which is why, you know, the annual stats and the provincial governmenting reporting reports are pretty slow. And that is because they are filled with modules. They have a lot of modules. Those are reports, especially the annual stats, you only run once or twice a year, and the provincial government reporting you only run monthly. So those are reports where I feel like it's worth having more modules and having the reports run a little bit slower, because you only have to run them every once in a while, and it's better to just have one report that you run and then you're done for the month. Even if it takes a few minutes. But so sort of a balance, like how often you're going to be running this versus how slow it's going to be. You have to add well, maybe not quite a few, but you have to add at least a few modules to a report before you start seeing significant lag in the reporting time, typically. It also depends on how busy the server is, which is to say how many people are accessing Outcome Tracker at the time that you are, and things like that too. But typically, you'll have to have at least a few modules before the report starts to lag. So yeah, those are multi-module reports, something I wanted to get into with you today because those are often helpful. And are there any questions or comments? I'll wait a moment and wait for a question or comment to roll in, if it should. All right, no questions or comments, so let's move on. So you want a chart. This happens typically in Outcome Tracker. Let's say I want a pie chart that shows me the total score. I can do that in Outcome Tracker, and it is not terribly difficult. I'll walk you through how to do that. So let's do, oh, sorry, I don't want to do that. I don't want to edit module. I want to add new crosstab. Let's say total score pie chart. So, sorry, actually add new chart. That's what I want. Sorry. So when you create a query, you had the option. Sorry, when you create a report, when we first created the report, you had the option to add a new crosstab or create a crosstab with chart. So if you are creating a report only to have a chart, that's what you would do. Just choose the one that says chart. If you want to add a module to a report that is just a chart, then you would go to add new chart here. So I hope that makes sense, but that's basically what we're looking at. So we want to find the query that has the information that we want. D8 query, here it is. Let's select that. We want pie chart. Default theme is fine. Let's call it total scores and categories. We want total score as the category. category data, data values. Let's do ranges maybe. I'm just looking through here. I don't actually create charts too often in outcome tracker, so just interested in, yeah, let's do count. Some perhaps. No, count's good. All right. So this is basically what you would do. Add a new chart. Select the query as you would for as a regular module or report. Choose the category that you want. For instance, if we wanted was client born in Canada, then we have that. That's actually maybe clear. Let's use that for example. So this would be the number of people who answered a DA, who did a DA, and their answers to this question, whether or not they were born in Canada. So count, we can sum. Doesn't really make sense in this average. Doesn't really make sense. So probably just want count. Location, we can have it beside the first two or underneath the first or second. I want to put it underneath the first. Let's just say, click save. So you can see it shows up here the answers to the question. Let's edit. I want to edit chart. So I want to show you. You do pie chart, line chart, area chart, column chart, bar chart. I have to say that excuse me. I have to say that outcome tracker's abilities with charts is, in my opinion, limited. So if you need to create a chart for your data, or if you want to do quick in-depth analysis of your data, you might want to export to Excel, which is something that we do pretty regularly. So let's export queries. That's how you would do that. You can run your report, export queries, or if you have a query that you run, then you can just export that. Export queries, we'll export it to Excel. So we see we have our Excel spreadsheets here. Let's open one of them. If you have any proficiency at all with Excel, I think that creating charts in Excel is easier, and you have way more options with charts in Excel than you do in outcome tracker. So it's just something to keep in mind that you might want to move your information to Excel and do your charts in there rather than in outcome tracker. So this is something to keep in mind. Another thing is you might have, if you're proficient at all in Excel, you might have information that you want to pull out of outcome tracker, but it's just a one-time thing. You don't think you'll ever need to know this particular data point again, and it might take you a little while to create the report in outcome tracker. In that case, it might be worth just exporting a query to Excel and doing the data analysis in Excel, because Excel is faster and more responsive. There is a drawback to that, and that is that reports on outcome tracker are dynamic, which means that they update as you put in information or edit information in outcome tracker. Whereas, of course, the Excel document that you export is not linked to your data in outcome tracker. So if you make changes in outcome tracker to your data, they will not be reflected in any previously exported Excel documents. So just something to keep in mind. If you want to create a chart in an outcome tracker, it will update automatically as data is edited and updated in outcome tracker. But if you want to create one in Excel, you have more options, and it's more, in my opinion, intuitive, but it's not dynamic. So if you can wind up presenting information that may be outdated if you choose to go that route. But that is an option for you if you have proficiency with Excel. It's it's fairly straightforward to export your information to Excel and create charts and graphs there. So something to keep in mind. So yeah, I think we went over everything in this slide. Let's move on. Reporting to the provincial government. I did want to go over this last point just because it's important. It's something to do monthly. Probably most of you understand the process for reporting to the provincial government, but just in case you don't, reports are already created in OT to meet your reporting requirements to the provincial government. And there is a process, a bit of a process, because the reports in Outcome Tracker that go to the provincial government are anonymous. They've had identifying information left out of them. So because of that, they're hard to verify the information. So right here, you'll see there's the provincial government reportings. The name has recently changed. It used to be HS, but the department is no longer called HS, so we decided on Outcome Tracker to call it provincial government reports. So a little heads up with that for the people who are on the call. So you have the audit reports and the export reports. The export reports are what you send to the provincial government. However, those don't have identifying information on them. So what we suggest you do for your monthly governmental reporting requirements is go to the audit reports. Let's say I'm an emergency residential shelter. These are all the informations that display in the export report. So you use these to verify your information. I'm not going to run one right now because it would be very long, but you would use these to verify your information, and then you would run the export report to export the data, and you would export the queries just as I exported it to Excel earlier. You would export, and then you would attach that zip file as an attachment to an email and send that to the provincial government. So that's sort of the process for reporting to the provincial government. I figured we should go over it since we're talking about reports. Provincial government reporting is the #1 report probably that you will run in Outcome Tracker. So the process is audit and then export. Audit, verify your information, and then run the export reports, and then send that to your contact within the provincial government. All right, so that's it. I think that's all the information I had to go over for reports and queries. Kat, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to add. You could jump in if you do. If not, are there any questions that people had? If you have a question, you can just sort of type in, I have a question in the questions box, and then I will unmute you and we can discuss your question. And I'll just give you a few minutes to do that. So Terry had asked the OBSD reporting. She uses that to verify. So maybe I will unmute Terry and let her explain more clearly. So, hi Terry, are you there?
Hi.
Hi Terry. So can you explain more what you mean by that?
Oh, well, when I'm doing a month-end report, when I need, like if I do my report and I see my numbers are wonky, then I'll just go into this report, because you can actually click onto the, well, like say, for example, I know we had 8 people discharge, right? And only 7 is showing up. Then I can go onto the discharges, and I can actually click on that, and it'll give me a list of all the people that had been discharged. Then I can verify it and find that one that isn't connected. And sometimes that's because it's not linked to the admission. So just by using this, I find it helps me do my reports.
So that is definitely something you can use. What I would suggest is that you use the audit reports, which should get you the same result. So let me show you where that is. So in the same provincial government reports, there's the audit reports.
Great. I never knew how to use that one. I just thought it was for other things.
Yeah. It doesn't make a difference because it doesn't make too much of a difference because as you'll see, these are the same exact reports that are in that OBSD
Right.
reporting folder. The only difference is that the ones in the OBSD reporting folder are broken down. There's 2 reports for each one in
More,
here,
yeah.
one by program name and one by staff name. And that is because the OBSD reports were designed for the narrative reporting that you have to do for the government, and there's a section on the narrative reporting about ICM, I believe. And at the time that we created those reports, and it's still sort of the case now, that ICM is used in pretty different ways by different people. So we created those reports because some people create a program, some people hire a particular staff member with the ICM funding. So we created those reports to make sure that they can report on how they're using the ICM funding in the OBSD reports, the narrative reports.
So on this particular one,
I'm sorry, what was that?
On this particular one here, say for example, I could click on the number 5 and it'll bring me up all my information I need.
Right. Yeah, you can do that with these too.
For the main report, it won't do that. Okay.
Right. The main is because, as I was explaining earlier, it's because it's more anonymous. Yeah, exactly. All right. So does that answer your question?
Oh yeah. No, I was just thinking, like I didn't know about this, so I just thought, that's what I've been using for the last 2 or 3 years, and I seem to have good luck.
Yeah, that's a good point. So if you were, it's not necessarily a mistake because those reports will work for you. But
and it's just looking for things that's gone missing too, right?
Right. Yeah. This will probably be easier for you because there's fewer reports and probably less confusing. But yeah. So and if you've made that mistake, it could be that other people did too. So it's useful to chat about. So yeah, audit reports. Yeah.
Thank you.
No worries. Are there any other questions? All right. I don't think we have any more questions, and that was all that I wanted to go over for this webinar. Kat, do you have anything that you might want to add? Kat, I think might have stepped away from her computer. So
Hi there.
I think
I did step away, but I'm back. What can I?
I was just asking if there's anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to make sure we touched base on.
No, I think we've covered everything.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to let the attendees go then. I will let you know that after I end the webinar, there will be a short survey for you to answer about the webinar, whether or not you learned what you needed to learn and all those sorts of things. So it's 10 questions, should be really quick. If you take the time to answer that survey would help us out. And I hope that you learned something useful, and I hope to see you all soon, and have a good day.